Welcomes you here to the very last of our lectures for this semester. The semester title, as you all know, is Politics and Religion, Age-Old Tensions Revisited. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, there's a little bit of information I want to share with you. Two items. The first one is here. PrincetonTV.org, and I understand you don't even need a www in front of it, is the web address that anyone who wants to, beginning around the middle of May, will be able to see on the web all of these lectures. So they're up free for you to see about a month or so after the conclusion of the semester. So PrincetonTV.org, and we want to thank Serge up in the background for the videotaping or the filming of the series, and he does all the work in the editing and posting of this. The second bit of business is to answer many of you've questioned us as we were standing up at the front about what next semester's general title will be. And the lecture committee of the Princeton Adult School has been working for over a year on this coming series. And it's going to be basically on bioethics, on multiple different areas of bioethics. I've been very interested personally as a physician to pursue this, and we really hope that you will all sign up again and encourage other friends and relatives to come. As a bit of a teaser, let me tell you that we will have the former president of Princeton University, Harold Shapiro, who was the chairperson of President Bill Clinton's Commission on Bioethics, as one of our speakers. We've got locally, regionally, and even nationally known speakers already lined up. So it promises to be another a great series, and we hope to see all of you back here. Now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce tonight's speaker. Sitting to my right is Bernard Hagel, who's professor of Near Eastern Studies. And I'd like to quote something that I saw when I was looking up a little bit of his bio. And if I may go for a sentence or so, he says, "I was born in Lebanon and came to consciousness during its civil war. It is perhaps because of this that questions of religious identity and the tensions that arise from it are of particular interest for me." Bernard Hagel is professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, and he specializes in the history and politics of the Middle East. He received his doctorate in philosophy in 1998 from the University of Oxford, and his main research focuses are on Islamic political movements, Islamic law, and the history of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and other areas. He has recently completed a book on the religious politics of Saudi Arabia since the early 1950s, when the Saudi regime developed institutions and strategies for projecting its version of Islam, known as Salafism and Wahhabism, throughout the rest of the world. And this book will be published shortly by Cambridge, or has it been published yet?
Not quite.
Not quite. Shortly published by Cambridge University Press. He's published extensively on the Salafi movement in both its pre-modern and modern manifestations. In particular, his book entitled Revival and Reform in Islam was published by Cambridge in 2003, and this fully explores this strand of Islamic and legal and political thought. He has many titles here at Princeton. Besides being a full professor in the Near Eastern Studies. He directs the Institute for Trans-Regional Study of the Contemporary Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, as well as the Oil, Energy, and Middle East Project of the Princeton Environmental Institute. So you're wearing many different hats. In addition, he advises the British and U.S. governments on Islamic and Middle Eastern affairs and has been involved in a number of key court issues relating to terrorism since 9/11. He's studied in many areas around the world. Princeton has recently stolen him away from NYU, and this is he's completing his second semester of being a full professor here. And I understand that he's going to be going back to New York tonight because his wife and children are still living in New York. So we will respect his needs to get back to the city later on. And we really especially thank you for coming and being willing to speak at a late hour today. Tonight's lecture is titled, "Is There a Separation Between Religion and State in Islam?" Please help me welcome Bernard Hakel.
Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure to speak to you tonight. The title of the talk is There a Separation Between Religion and State in Islam? And the title, as I'm sure you can sort of intuit and understand, is quite problematic because of all the problems that the Muslim world, and especially America's relationship with the Muslim world and the Arab world, the problematic nature of that relationship makes the question all the more pertinent and important for us to discuss tonight. So the question as posed is problematic and fraught with difficulties because of the many hotly debated issues relating to Islam and to the Muslim world today. Among these questions, though, and perhaps the most important, is whether Islam is compatible with democracy. And that's really the question that lies under the title of the talk. Let me preface my remarks here by giving you the answer, not making you wait till the very end. My answer to both these questions, the first being the separation, whether Islam can separate religion from state, and the second, whether Islam and democracy are compatible. The answer to both these questions is no and no. And there is no separation, at least as Islam is understood today by a vast majority of its adherents and especially its political activists. There is no separation between Islam and state, between religion and state in Islam, and the dominant forces in the Middle East today and in much of the Muslim world, with a couple of exceptions, and I will get to them at the very end of the talk, will say that liberal democracy, as we understand it here in the United States, is incompatible with Islamic rule. But let me also complicate the picture for you by providing some nuance and context for my categorical answers. You'll see, I hope, that the negative answers I provide have to do with particular and a recent set of events and the emergence of political and social forces in the Arab world in particular, all of which are fighting, militating, sometimes violently, against this separation and against the emergence of a democratic solution to the politics in the Middle East. Before I get into the nuance, let me give you some historical and doctrinal background on Islam. The Quran, which is the core text of the Muslim religion, does not provide a blueprint for government. There is no form of government that you can get from it. Succession is not dealt with, and a number of core issues that one would think of when thinking of a constitution, for instance, a political constitution, are not to be found in the Quran. It does, however, mention some things about politics, namely that sovereignty belongs to God, in Arabic, Allah. It is God's rule, His laws, His commands which the community of Muslims must enforce. The community must settle its differences by referring to God's law, not to their own law, not to any man-made law. Let me give you some examples of verses where some of this is mentioned, specifically on God's rule and his sovereignty. In chapter 5, verse 44, 45, and 47, this is a chapter called Al-Ma'idah in Arabic, the table. And those who do not rule according to God's revelation are the unbelievers, the oppressors, and the grave sinners. In a chapter entitled The Women, which is 4:59, verse 59, O believers, obey God and obey Muhammad, the messenger, and those in authority among you. If you should quarrel on anything, refer it to God and the messenger. In yet another chapter, 42, verse 10, in whatever you differ, the settling decision is with God. The rule of God in the Quran is often juxtaposed with the very opposite of his rule, which is the following of, in here I'm quoting, the following of one's whims, or idolatry, or witchcraft, all of which the Quran severely chastises and says Muslims and believers ought not to follow. And this, by the way, is not specific in the way the Quran talks about these issues. It's not only addressing Muslims. It's addressing humanity. It talks about Jews and it talks about Christians in the very same term. Jews were dominant or powerful when they followed and adhered to God's law. They fell into error when they deviated from God's law. Similarly for Christians. This is the language that the book uses. And this language is bolstered very often by what are called in Arabic hadith. These are traditions or narratives of what the Prophet said and did. Again, some more background. So how did this non-blueprint, this non-existing blueprint, except for the few verses that I mentioned here, get enacted? What did Muslim society and Muslim politics look like after the death of the Prophet? Basically, for much of Muslim history, rulers derived their legitimacy from the application and enforcement of God's law. He is owed obedience from his subjects because of such performance, because he does apply God's law. If a ruler abandons Islam, if a ruler says, I'm no longer a Muslim, he apostatizes, or if he refuses to implement God's law, or implements some other law, let's say a man-made law, then he forfeits his legitimacy. In such a circumstance, Muslim jurists and intellectuals have debated whether rebellion against such a ruler becomes mandatory or permissible, as opposed to continued obedience to an unjust ruler, a ruler who does not apply Islamic law. The Sunnis, that is 90% of all Muslims in the world today, the majority community, some 1 billion people, have argued that obedience is necessary, even if Muslims are ruled by an unjust ruler. Some Shi'is, this is the 10% community, the minority community, some 1 to 200 million people, have argued variously that either obedience is necessary, others have said no, rebellion becomes a requirement in the event that one is ruled by an unjust ruler. The dominant view, though, is one of quietism, of political obedience, and of acceptance that an ideal cannot be obtained if you have an unjust ruler. There is, however, an ideal. There is a theoretical ideal that justice should prevail, that the ruler should fulfill many conditions. Amongst these conditions, that he should be a member of the Prophet's tribe, a descendant of the Prophet's tribe, that he should be learned, he should be whole, he cannot be missing a finger, he cannot have any handicap, physical handicap. So the rules and requirements of a just ruler are actually to be found in Islamic legal books, but very often the de facto rulers fell very far from the ideal. And Muslims have essentially said, well, it's better to put up with an unjust but known ruler than to rebel against him and take the risk of a civil war taking place between Muslims or internecine fighting where many people might die and bloodshed is certain to take place. Rulers in Muslim history are called sultans, or salatin in Arabic is the plural. A sultan is literally someone who has power. They are often, as I said, they often fell very far from the ideal, and they often issued commands and promulgated decisions that were not based on Islamic law. This is what is called the Sharia in Arabic. But as long as they preserved the facade of Islamic belief and they permitted Islamic life, that is, mosques remained open, they defended the borders of Islam, as long as Islamic law, courts, Islamic legal courts were allowed to function, Muslims were not to rebel against them, and they were not to be fought. The argument that has run through most of Islamic history is that fighting or rebelling against the sultan, against the ruler, would invariably lead to civil strife, and that this would lead to bloodshed, as I just mentioned. The term for civil strife is fitna in Arabic, and this is just too heavy a price to pay for justice, for just rule, that is. Now, the other basic problem from our perspective, the perspective of post-Enlightenment, secular Democrats, is that any political system that is based on Islamic law, on the Sharia, is not one that is anchored in notions of citizenship, but rather is anchored in notions of an understanding of society as being divided between believers and non-believers, people who are Muslims and people who are non-Muslims. It is also a legal system that differentiates, that is highly gendered, that differentiates between men and women, between Muslims who choose to believe and those who choose not to believe. And there are very severe penalties for apostasy in Islam. There are also there are strictures, legal strictures, very detailed legal rulings that pertain to non-Muslims living in a Muslim state. This is not sort of invented stuff. You can find it in the texts, in Muslim legal texts, in the traditions of the Prophet. And any Muslim state that is constituted will have to deal with these texts and will have to deal with these rulings. What do you do with non-Muslims? Can they vote, for instance? Do they have full civil rights? Do women have full civil rights? And these are, again, not theoretical questions. In a country like Saudi Arabia today, women are not allowed to drive. And I can tell you why. The chief mufti of Saudi Arabia, a man I met, told me why women could not drive. Now, there are two kinds of answers that you get if you speak to Saudi clerics. The legal answer that they give to why women are not permitted to drive is essentially a means-ends kind of argument. Basically, women are not allowed to leave the home without the permission of their guardians or their wards, either their fathers or their husbands. And if they were allowed to drive, they could move around in ways in which their guardians are not aware or not in control of. And therefore, this movement might lead to an end that is itself illegal. Let's say the mixing of women and men who are not brothers or husbands and wives. It's about controlling the movement of women, basically, and ultimately about preventing them from doing things that the law does not permit, such as the commingling of the sexes by that are people who are unrelated to each other. The other argument that I heard myself from the chief mufti of Saudi Arabia, which is really, frankly, a very risible argument, and shows you the kind of silly, maybe even pathetic kind of argument of the man himself, but also of the standing that he has today in Saudi Arabia, is he told me, referring to me as my son, he said, my son, we have very bad traffic jams in Saudi Arabia today, especially in Riyadh, the capital city. And, and it's only men who are driving, and we have really bad traffic jams. If we were to allow women to drive, then we would double the traffic in our town, and the jams would get that much worse. So it's silly. I mean, it's an absolutely absurd argument, because women are clearly moving around in the city, but are not driving themselves. They have to have a chauffeur. They have to have a driver in order to do so. And there are many serious consequences. You have to be able to afford a chauffeur, to pay for one, and so on. These are questions that, again, are real. They're not theoretical. They are real. And Saudi Arabia, which is a society that proclaims to be based on Islamic law, does not have a constitution, calls the Quran its constitution, chooses to implement Islamic law in a way that has very real consequences, not only to women, but let's say to non-Muslims as well. Non-Muslims in Saudi Arabia are not permitted to build churches or synagogues. You're not permitted to have places of worship that are non-Muslim, that are not Islamic. It also chooses to discriminate against a Shiite minority. This minority group of Muslims in Saudi Arabia, who are Shiites, do not belong to the dominant Sunni group. And again, Shiites are not permitted to open mosques. They're constantly being harassed in schools. They're being taught in schools that Shiites, that is, teachers are teaching Shiite children that Shiites are heretics, they're bad Muslims, and their history is often vilified, and so on. So the problems are very real. Those who argue for an Islam that is both democratic and secular often present their case in highly theoretical language and posit an ideal of Islam that exists only on the pages, in the words on the pages, on which which are written in their books. They are not anchored in a practical reality. And here I want to turn to a couple of the Muslims who have argued very kind of valiantly and have often paid a very high price for positing an ideal that is both democratic and secular. The first example is a man, a scholar, an Egyptian man. His name was Ali Abdul Razik. He wrote a book which is very famous in the Muslim world called The Principles of Rule in Islam. This was published in 1924. He was a scholar of the top university in the Sunni world. This is Al-Azhar University in Cairo. And in this book, he argued that the Prophet Muhammad had two different kinds of authority. The first was spiritual or religious, and the other was temporal and political. The latter, the temporal political authority that the Prophet had ended with his life, once he died. And that the Quran, as I said earlier to you, did not provide a blueprint for political rule. As such, Ali Abdul Razik argued, Islam should be reserved to belief, to practice that is both private and personal in nature, and that in the realm of politics, Islam should have very little or no say at all. The man, for publishing this book, was tried, and a huge debate took place in Egypt and in the Muslim world at the time. He was stripped of his job. He was vilified. Many books were written against him. And he is regarded by many to have been, and to be, he's now dead, to have been a traitor to Islam. He was not declared an apostate, partly because he came from a very wealthy and well-connected family. His brother, in fact, ended up becoming the head of the university, of Al-Azhar University. But this debate, the debate that started with his book about the nature of authority and politics in Islam, continues till today. And many Muslims who argue for the same kind of ideal, an ideal that is both secular and democratic, such Muslims very often are based in the West. Some are in fact people who've had to flee from countries like Egypt for holding their views, for holding such views. And one such person is in fact a graduate of both my department here and at Princeton University. He's now a professor of law at UCLA, and his name is Khalid Abul Fadl. His argument for the compatibility of Islam and democracy and secularism is really, can only be described as an aesthetic argument. He makes appeal to certain core values in Islam that he argues are beautiful and just. And that if one only clings to these ideals, one is able to, as it were, jettison or alter some of the rulings, both historical and in the books, that might prevent secularism from emerging or democracy from emerging. Again, the model that he posits looks great, sounds great, but it has no practical basis, and he certainly has very few followers, at least in the Muslim world, that I know of. Another group of people who have argued for this compatibility, or at least for certain constraints on the rule of a Muslim sultan, are people who have argued for constitutionalism, who have argued that Muslim societies ought to have constitutions. And this is a movement that started in the 19th century. One had it in the former Ottoman Empire in Turkey, but also in Iran, most importantly. And the history of Muslims engaged in constitutionalism and constitution writing has not been so much about constraining or limiting the power of government, but rather about making government rule more efficient, more effective, and perhaps more principled, but not limiting the powers of the government. And you can see this quite clearly in the present constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran. If you look at this constitution, it's a very interesting document, almost schizophrenic actually in nature. On the one hand, the Iranian constitution looks very much like a republican document in that it talks about a parliament, it talks about representatives of the people in parliament, elections, a presidency, all the structures that one would recognize in a republican setup. But it also contains something quite unusual, which is that it has a parallel system that rides on top of the republican institutions and which is Islamic. You have certain councils of jurists, you have a supreme jurist, a faqih. The first one was Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and presently the ruler of Iran, the faqih in Iran, is Ayatollah Khamenei. This person has absolute power and final say over any rule, any law that the parliament might promulgate. This council of jurists and this supreme jurist can throw out any law, can alter any law, and can also dictate and decide on who runs in elections, in vetting the candidates for elections, and essentially making sure that the form of government and governance in Iran remains consistent with an Islamic Sharia-based model that is certainly not secular, that discriminates against people who are opposed to the regime, and also against people who are not full citizens or full subjects of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Sunnis, for instance, are discriminated against in Iran, just as Shiites are discriminated against in Saudi Arabia. And you have lots of restrictions on forms of political activism and activity and association in that country. Again, all the arguments for these restrictions are anchored in a particular interpretation of Islam. Now, I should also, and perhaps I should have said this at the very beginning, but you should get from my talk and from this outlining of different positions and different people is that there is no one Islam. there are Islams. There are various interpretations of this religion. There are dominant ones, though. And when I talk about secularism and democracy as not being consistent with Islam, I don't mean this as a normative argument against the religion itself, but rather against the dominant groups that are interpreting this religion today. What I'm saying is that the dominant forces in Iran and in most, if not all, the Arab world, groups, Islamists, people who have an Islamic political agenda, these people, many of them would come to power if there were elections, free elections tomorrow, and all of them would not adhere to either a secular model or a democratic model of rule. Let me turn to these people now, the Islamists, the opponents of both secularism and democracy. These disagree vociferously with any secular vision of Islam or Islamic rule. And let me outline and give you some quotes from two such scholars. I can also later on talk a little bit about Al-Qaeda, but I'd rather not do this in the lecture, but rather in the question and answer period. So I encourage you to ask me about Al-Qaeda and their views, but let's leave that till later. The first person who argues against secularism and democracy is one Dr. Ja'far Sheikh Idris. This is a Sudanese thinker. He's very prominent on the internet today. And this is what he says. I have a slightly longish quote from both these people. Please bear with me. It is now seen, he says, that citizenship rather than religion should be the basis of belonging to a state. Since different citizens may have different religions, if the state commits to one religion, members of other faiths would feel alienated since a foreign religion would be imposed on them. So how are Muslims to approach the modern trend of separation of religion and state? The basic belief in Islam is that the Quran is 100% the word of Allah, the word of God, and that the Sunnah, this is the practice of the Prophet, was also a result of the guidance of God to the Prophet. Islam cannot be separated from the state because it guides us through every detail of running the state and our lives. Muslims have no choice but to reject secularism, for it excludes the law of God. No Muslim could become president in a secular regime. For in order to do so, he would have to pledge loyalty to the constitution. A Muslim would have to abandon part of his belief and embrace the belief of secularism, which is practically another religion. For Muslims, the word religion does not only refer to a collection of beliefs and rituals, it refers to a way of life, which includes all values, behaviors, and details of living. Secularism cannot be a solution for countries with a Muslim majority or even a sizable minority, for it requires people to replace their God-given beliefs with an entirely different set of man-made beliefs. Separation of religion and state is not an option for Muslims because it requires us, Muslims, to abandon God's decree for that of a man. This is the point that he's making, 2 points really, that ought to be kept in mind, is one, that Islamism and Islamists argue that Islam is not something that you do on Friday. It's not something that is relegated to the private realm or to the family. It is comprehensive. It is something that intrudes and it makes expectations of you in every aspect of your life. And as such, any secular system or any non-Islamic system would entail a Muslim having to betray some of the requirements of the religion. Another person, so this is one point, the comprehensiveness of the religion. And the other is that secular democratic systems and states promulgate laws because the people are sovereign, the people are represented by representatives in parliaments, parliaments issue laws, These laws are often not consistent, are not compatible with Islamic law. There's no way of vetting these laws or making them compatible, and therefore the system itself is not legitimate because God is not the ruler, is not the sovereign in a secular democratic system. The other person I want to mention to you today is Dr. Yusuf Al-Qaradawi. This guy is a media sheikh. He's a major figure in the Arab world and in the Muslim world. He has a weekly satellite television program. He is an Egyptian and a Muslim brother who lives in Qatar, which is a small state in the Persian Gulf, where we have a very large base, by the way, military base. And Yusuf Al-Qaradawi is someone who has published several hundred books now, is a major media personality, and a reference for many, many Muslims around the world as to how they should understand their religion and how they should live it and understand it. This is what he says about secularism. And I will get to democracy in a moment. So he says, secularism may be accepted in a Christian society, but can never enjoy a general acceptance in an Islamic society. For Muslim societies, the acceptance of secularism means something totally different. And he's juxtaposing it to his idea of Christian society. He says basically that in Christian society, the idea of God is one of a watchmaker or a clockmaker. God basically sets up the world and the universe and it lets it run. In the Muslim system, God, and in Muslim belief, God is not someone who just abandons creation, but rather intervenes and is constantly involved in creation in every second of creation and is present all the time. So in Islam, and again, this idea of comprehensiveness comes up again. Islam is a comprehensive system of worship and legislation. The acceptance of secularism means abandonment of Islamic law, the Sharia, a denial of the divine guidance, and a rejection of God's injunctions. It is indeed a false claim that Islamic law is not proper to the requirements of the present age. The acceptance of a legislation formulated by humans means a preference of the human's limited knowledge and experiences to the divine guidance. For this reason, the call for secularism amongst Muslims is atheism and a rejection of Islam. Its acceptance, the acceptance of secularism as a basis for rule in place of Islamic law, is downright apostasy. Allah, or God, revealed his divine guidance to humanity, made certain things permissible and others prohibited, commanded people to observe his injunctions and to judge according to them. If they do not do so, if people do not live by God's commandments, if they commit infidelity or unbelief, then they are aggressors, transgressors, and infidels. There is no compromise here in this vision. It is a vision in which this particular group, this particular man, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, clearly wants to come to power. He wants these people and his like-minded people to come to power and apply an Islamic Sharia-based regime. Now, what is that vision? What would a Muslim state ruled by someone like Al-Qaradawi look like? Here, Islamists are very hazy and unclear as to what the society, what the government would look like. And I think this is a deliberate policy on their part. They say, we will apply Islamic law will provide the answers. Well, what answers would they be? How would you actually put food on the table? How would you solve some of the core problems that Muslims and non-Muslims face today in the world? The answers are nebulous, often very, deliberately sort of fudging in their form, and frankly, I don't think they have the answers. These people, Muslim brothers and the Islamists, do not have the answers. They hope that God will provide them guidance once they come to power. Now, there are some models of democratic rule in the Muslim world, not in the Arab world, but in the Muslim world. And you have to remember that most Muslims are actually not Arabs. And here, I'd like to talk very briefly about Turkey. I'm quite bullish, actually, on Turkey, and I think it's an amazing country in which some very remarkable things are taking place. So Turkey is a Muslim majority country. The political party that is in power today, called the AKP or AKP in Turkish, is a self-declared Islamist party, but very, very different from the Islamic parties or the Islamist parties that you see in the Arab world. Very different from the Muslim Brotherhood. And in one crucial respect, the AKP in Turkey does not wish to apply Islamic law and does not see Islamic law as a blueprint for a form of governance. The AKP seems to have a vision of Islam that, in fact, resembles very much Christian democratic parties that you would find in some European countries, like in Germany, for instance, where religion is something quite private. And again, Turkey has a very particular historical experience, because in Turkey, the fundamentalists, to use that term, are in fact the secularists, not the religious people. There is a group, a fairly sizable percentage of the population, but certainly amongst the elites and amongst the military in Turkey, who belong and adhere to an ideology called Kemalism. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk is the founder of the modern Republic of Turkey, and he had an ideology that was radically secular and anti-Islamic and anti-religious in general. That ideology prevents women from wearing the veil at universities or even in public offices, in parliament, and so on. And it seems to me that the AKP, this Islamic party in Turkey, wishes to grant observant Muslims certain rights, such as and most importantly, the ability to express their religiosity in public spaces. That seems to me the extent of the demands that the AKP is making as far as Islam and Islamic governance are concerned in Turkey. And that is very different, as I said, from what is the case in the Arab countries of the Muslim world. And it seems to me that with Turkey's economic success, incredibly successful country economically, it seems, and the fact that it's being ruled by this Islamic party that has very limited ambitions, it seems that Turkey might, and I hope it does, prove a model for other Muslim populations where the party decides that, in fact, Islam is something to be relegated to the private sphere and not to the public domain of politics. But again, the Turkish model is quite specific. I can get into it in the question and answer period, but it is certainly, I hope, a beacon for the gloomy picture that I presented earlier. Now, the conclusion that I'd like to come to in the last few seconds is this. So how is Islamic rule and ideas and conceptions of Islam and politics to change and become perhaps compatible with democracy and secularism? I don't think any book or any number of books can be written in the West or elsewhere that will change the picture that I gave you. It really, I think, and I believe quite strongly, that if Islam is to turn and become democratic and secular, this can only happen from practical, real experience that would lead to an Islamist party such as the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power in a country like Egypt through democratic elections, and for these people, for this party to face real problems, real issues, and real constraints. And perhaps for a while, they will be authoritarian, and I have no doubt that they will be. And they will be perhaps terrible to women and to minorities and to non-Muslims and to Muslims who decide to not be Muslims. But eventually, the model that they posit, the model of a Sharia-based society in which Islamic law is comprehensively involved in every aspect of public and private life, that model will fail. Will fail economically and will fail politically, and eventually something will emerge from that failure. A model that perhaps, and I hope, will be democratic and secular. But for that to emerge, a real trial for Islamic political activists and Islamists must take place, and for a major Muslim country to be dominated by this group, and for that group to then fail, and a new ideology based on experience to emerge that will move us away from God's sovereignty to man's sovereignty. Thank you. So if you have any questions. Yes, sir.
What about Islam in Indonesia? How does that differ from other forms?
Okay, that's a good question. Islam, I mean, the examples that I had of possible, I mean, of the bright democratic exceptions, I called them, are Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Turkey, all non-Arab countries. In the Indonesian case, you do have elections. You do have a form of governance that looks quite democratic. But the party that is in power is not Islamic, and doesn't profess to be, based on an Islamist ideology at least. And I don't think, even if they were successful as a model of governance and of rule, that will transfer to the mainlands of Islam, what I call the mainlands of Islam, namely the Arab world, places like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, Iran, Iraq, and so on. Those are the core countries in which the fate of Islam and its politics will be determined. Yes, sir.
Yes. The comments that you've made about the effect of Sharia seem to be internal to the country. How about the effect of governments ruled by Sharia externally with respect to the Western world?
So let me perhaps rephrase your question. So you're saying, you're asking me about countries that are ruled by the Sharia and what their attitude and their policies would be towards the Western world, towards the let's say the non-Muslim world. Okay. Here I'd have to talk about specific countries. So a country like Afghanistan, for instance, that was ruled by the Taliban was very hostile to the non-Muslim world. A country like Saudi Arabia is paradoxical because fundamentally the ideology is quite hostile, not just to the West and to non-Muslims in general, but also to Muslims who disagree with their particular interpretation of Islam. Okay? However, you have a very important factor in Saudi Arabia, which is that of oil. And they can't drink it or eat it. They have to sell it. And they mainly have to sell it to non-Muslims because that's where most of the consumers are. So they have this, they wear these two hats. They're quite pro-Western and pro-American, largely because America also provides the protection, the military protection for the regime. So they have this, the side that talks to the West that is very friendly, and in fact is often very friendly. Saudi Arabia played a very important role during the Cold War in subsidizing many of the movements that fought communism all over the place, in Central America and Afghanistan against the Russians and so on. But domestically, the policy is quite different. And those are really the only two countries that, under the Taliban, Afghanistan under the Taliban, and Saudi Arabia presently, that are fully sort of Islamic in claim to be ruled by Islamic law. Yes, sir.
You said that the Quran doesn't go into law specifically in any detail, but the Sharia seems I don't know anything about the Sharia. Where
Right.
did that come from?
No.
What was the root of Sharia?
Okay, so
The question,
yeah, but it's about the Quran, and the questioner asked me, said that I said that the Quran doesn't talk very much about law, and whereas the Sharia does.
Not specifically, I think is what you said.
Right. So okay, so the Quran actually has 500 verses that pertain to law. Okay, but the law that it mostly talks about have to do with inheritance questions, some questions to do with criminal law, torts, but very little to do with politics. Almost nothing on politics and on governance specifically.
Where did the Sharia come from?
Okay, so the Sharia, which is the body of Islamic law, is based on 4 principles. The first is the Quran, or 4 sources. The second are the traditions and custom of the Prophet, what he said and did. The third is the consensus of the religious scholars. And the fourth is a form of reasoning by analogy. So the Quran, for instance, says don't express displeasure, verbal displeasure, when it comes to your parents. So don't say something nasty to your parents verbally. So a form of analogy would be in Islamic law, would be to say hitting your parents is also prohibited because it's that much worse than just a verbal expression of displeasure. This is a form of analogical reasoning that exists in Islam. And so most of Islamic law is in fact not the Quran. This is something you should also know, that the Quran is only one of 4 principles of Islamic law. And in fact, it is not the dominant principle in terms of the quantity of material that animates Islamic law. Yes, sir?
Would you talk a little bit about how Muslims living in the United States reconcile the American supposed ideals of tolerance, various religions, government, with what you've outlined as the beliefs of the Muslim world in the Quran? How do the Muslims in America reconcile these two?
Okay, so I mean, a lot of them are not necessarily religious people, right? I mean, Muslims are just like human beings, like any other, all of us, and they're not necessarily, very literalist, and they're not, reading the Quran word for word and saying, it says this and we must do that kind of thing. So many of them actually don't live this. There is no sort of cognitive disconnect here, or dissonance in their lives. They just think of America as a great country. In fact, they're very prosperous in America, and they do extremely well in America. And they're law-abiding and so on. Now, some of them, of course, very few of them, by the way, in America or elsewhere, are literalists and take this one particular interpretation of the religion very seriously, this kind of hard-edged, and some of them choose to leave because they don't want to live in America. Others choose to join radical groups. But again, we're talking about a very, very small minority. Most people, most Muslims in America choose to basically live just like the rest of us, which is to confine the religious aspect to the private sphere and not say we want an Islamic government or I refuse to vote because it's un-Islamic. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, just something along the same line, but more in a European context. Given your description of Islam, what is a proper response by governments like in France or maybe Germany or some other demands by Muslim groups to wear chadors and to, in effect, have their more orthodox ways recognized in some official way and tolerated? Is that compatible with democracy?
Well, again, I think, you can't lump the European countries all together. The French have a particular history and a particular interpretation of secularism, which is, quite hard-edged as well. And it has to do with the relationship that the state had with the Catholic Church in France. So there's a very strong antagonism towards, in French Republican political culture, towards the religious expression, religious sort of symbols in public space, in public life. And it applies equally to Sikhs as it does to Christians or Jews as well as Muslims. I personally think that the French way is certainly not the Anglo-Saxon way. It's not the way of the United States or of the UK. which is to say, you know, you're not allowed to wear the veil in school. It seems to me you make a much bigger issue of this one symbol, and it's just not worth it. Now, where I would draw the line, however, is in France, for example, where some Muslims have said, you know, that in locker rooms, they want to have separate bathrooms for Muslims, or we want to have separate water faucets and sort, you know, because Muslims and non-Muslims shouldn't be mixing that way. There I would draw the line. As far as England is concerned, it's very much like here. They just don't care. I mean, you can go to Heathrow and actually the person who, at the airport who will stamp your passport is a veiled woman. And I think that's probably, that's right. I mean, yes, sir.
If I understand it, you're saying that essentially Islamist intellectual, the mainstream, is of an opinion that secularism and democracy are not consistent with Islamic law. To what extent is that, are you talking about Islamic intellectuals in the Middle East? Because you do have these other countries mentioned that have huge Muslim populations, where is there not intellectual trains of thought in those countries that are supportive of consistency between Islam and secularism or democracy?
You do have, in Turkey you certainly have them. But the ones who are most prominent and most important politically are certainly the ones in the Arab world that I focused on mainly, are of the kind that I described. In Pakistan you also have them as well. But in Pakistan you also have a non-religious alternative that has to do with that country's particular history. But the preponderant weight, let's say when it comes to ideas about Islam and politics amongst Muslim diasporas in the West, that is Muslims who are engaged in the religion and very active in the religion, comes from the people that I described in the Middle East and from the Arab world. I mean, their voice carries much more than those who are arguing for a different alternative. Yes, ma'am.
You encouraged us to ask you about Al-Qaeda. Would you like to speak?
Yeah. Okay. So Al-Qaeda is sort of, as you can imagine, on even more to the right of someone like Al-Qaradawi that I described. I mean, they are against every imaginable ideology that they consider coming from the West, whether it's secularism or democracy, but they're also against socialism and they're against all kinds of rights that one would consider, other Muslims would agree to, for instance. And they're obsessed with an ideal of purity. They want to go back to what the Muslim community was like in the first 3 centuries of its existence, and they want to do this through violent means, if necessary. So they represent a very small percentage, very very small percentage of Muslim opinion. However, the danger in Al-Qaeda is that they have appropriated in their ideology, and they're very good at projecting their message through the internet and satellite television and so on. They've appropriated a lot of the grievances of the Muslim world against, especially the West. But there is a profound sense of humiliation and injustice that Muslims feel today. And some of it, I think, based on real facts. I mean, it's not just imagined. I mean, some of it is not legitimate, but most of it, I think, is quite legitimate. And Al-Qaeda gives voice to that sentiment. And that's the scariest part of Al-Qaeda, because they are the most eloquent. They are the most eloquent in expressing that sense of rage and that sense of humiliation and injustice. And I think that's where a lot of their appeal can be found. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about Iraq of 2008 and maybe where you have the triangulation of the Sunnis and the Shia and the Turks in the northern part. How can we expect them to cooperate in forming any type of democratic government, or do you think it's impossible?
Yeah, I'm not very optimistic or hopeful for Iraq. I think that it's a society that was very badly damaged by the regime before the invasion, and the invasion has certainly made things much, much worse. The problem in Iraq, the core of the problem in Iraq, is that you have oil in the ground. In the southern regions where Shiites are predominate, and in the northern regions where Kurds predominate. And the group that has been, as it were, left out in terms of the division of the goods and the spoils and the wealth of oil are the Sunnis. Now, Sunnis, although a minority, don't feel themselves, to be a minority, because in the wider region, beyond Iraq, they're not a minority. And secondly, the Sunnis have ruled Iraq for something like 1,000 years. Okay. So, I mean, what the United States did in Iraq, and you have to forgive me, it's not a very good analogy, but it's basically like a country invading the United States and deciding, that African Americans are going to rule. And whites will have absolutely no say in how the wealth of the country is to be handled, or in any matter of governance. I mean, that is the kind of shock that the United States has done to Iraq by replacing Sunni rule with Shiite rule. And the Sunnis will not take this lightly, and they will keep fighting to get a greater say and certainly greater wealth from the government. And now the situation in Iraq also has changed, and it's a very complicated situation in that, so the Americans show up and they basically say, okay, the Shiites are the majority, we have a democracy here, the Shiites should come to power, just based on numbers. Sunnis sort of freak out, as you can imagine, and they say, okay, we're going to teach you a lesson, and they go all out against the United States. Now, while going against the United States, they also have a mini civil war with the Shiites. And the Shiites, who are the downtrodden, who have been downtrodden for many centuries, decide to put up a fight, and in fact, give the Sunnis a serious beating. And the Sunnis are one-on-one, lose in this mini civil war that was not much reported here. And so what the Sunnis have decided to do is to say, well, maybe actually we should work with the Americans now against the Shiites, because the Shiites are, in the larger region, the enemies of the United States. So it's, a lot of moving parts, a lot of, it's changing alliances and so on. And my sense is that if the violence, the regional powers will try to contain the violence within Iraq, but it's not likely to stay there for very long. And also the other problem in Iraq, I mean, there are many problems. The other major problem in Iraq is that it's produced some 3 to 4 million refugees. And refugees are not like normal people. They've lost everything. And they have a political consciousness and a desire for things. And they have a radicalizing effect on any society they're in because of their experience. And so in 1948, when Israel was created, 700,000 Palestinian refugees, left what was then Palestine and went into the Arab world, mainly Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. And there they had a very radicalizing effect, and you had many coups and many civil wars as a result of the Palestinians and their kind of aggravating presence in these countries. Now these Iraqis are probably going to have the same effect on the region as well because of their experience. So it is an absolute mess and a mistake of just monumental proportion. Yes, ma'am.
You made a real distinction between Arab Islam and the rest of Islam. What is that distinction? Why is it so distinct?
Okay, so it's distinct because a couple of things that you need to realize. First of all, Islam as a religion in the Quran began with the Arabs, right? So it's in Arabic, and Arabs feel themselves to be like the first class Muslims, okay? They're actually not aware that they're not a majority. They think that they're a majority. And that's one thing. So they play a very important role. Most of the holy, actually all the main holy sites are in Arab lands. And they do have a kind of important voice because of this. A lot of the scholars of Islam have to know Arabic. You can't really be a scholar of Islam without knowing Arabic. It's the language of the Sharia and of the religion. So that also gives them an advantage. They're also strategically located. The Arab countries are very strategically located geographically, and it's where the West is most kind of intrusive. And it also happens to be where most of the Muslim wealth is located in the form of oil. So it's just unavoidable that Arabs play a preponderant role when it comes to Islam and politics, because that is where the friction with the West is most, that is where most of the wealth is, and that is where the center of intellectual production and political ideas is located. I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, there are 150 million Muslims in India, but no one ever hears anything about them or knows virtually knows anything about about them, because they just they just don't play that important a role in the politics of the Muslim world. Yes, sir.
Assuming your answer would be no, the question is, how well do you think the U.S. and the West is doing in their fighting with Al Qaeda?
Okay, so it's a good question. It's about the war against Al Qaeda and how well the U.S. is doing. So so the U.S. Is not doing well in the war against Al Qaeda, but the U.S. is also saved in this war by the fact that all the regimes of the Arab and Muslim world, as well as the French, the British, the Israelis, have turned against this group as well. Okay, so we're the beneficiaries of the kind of these authoritarian regimes that have kind of turned their intelligence services and their secret services against this group, and have brutalized this group, by the way. Many innocent people have also died and have been tortured in the name of the war against Al Qaeda in prisons in Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt, and elsewhere. So, we owe a good deal of our security and the fact that a second attack hasn't happened here since 9/11 to all these regimes turning on Al Qaeda. The other reason that Al Qaeda hasn't come and attacked us here is that Iraq has proven the main kind of, the American presence in Iraq has given Al Qaeda an incentive to go and fight the United States there, right? Because it's easier to kill an American there than it would be necessarily to come and have another huge attack here. And finally, the Muslim community in the United States has decided not to, but the vast majority of them have decided not to, engage in Al Qaeda's ideology or partake of it. And that has to do with both the fact that they're well ensconced in this country and they've done well here and I think believe in this country, but also because of these various terrorism trials that have taken place, and many of which innocent Muslims have been very badly treated. And that has terrified Muslims in the United States from thinking, talking, or doing anything that is remotely linked or related to politics or certainly Al Qaeda. So, to give you a very precise example, it just makes absolutely no sense to have a prison like Guantanamo, because that is a major propaganda tool. If I had a computer here, we can go on Al Qaeda's website, and you could see how the pictures and the imagery and the poetry that is about Guantanamo and how useful it is as a propaganda tool for recruiting people in the Muslim world. So, I mean, that's just one example of many, of just silliness. I mean, just stupidity of a kind of unbelievable kind. Yes, ma'am.
Can you say something about education levels in the Islamic State, how women are educated, or what levels they're educated, and also men? Do most people have
Right.
full education, college education?
No. Well, No. Again, it depends on the countries, but by and large, the illiteracy rates are very, very high. And even in countries where illiteracy rates are not so bad, it's also the quality of the education. So much of the education that takes place in the Arab and Muslim world here, beyond the Arab world as well, is of the kind where students are forced to memorize. There's a lot of rote memorization, where students are not encouraged to think critically, are not asked to write papers or to do research on their own. So you also have a quality of education that is of a very, very inferior and kind, and that produces, crushed students that are mentally crushed, that are not innovative or creative at all. So the education, both for women and men, is really quite bleak in these countries. Yes, ma'am.
I'm listening to you talk about Iraq and democracy, and we all know that there's a stated goal of having democracy and privatization in Iraq. And I'm trying to think about how we could possibly have gotten to this. If the State Department believes, as you believe, that they're incompatible. Is there a second school of thought here, or are we just totally on the
Well, the people who argued, I think the people who argued for, democracy in Iraq as a reason for invading, that was propaganda that was used for Americans to buy into this invasion. I don't think it was a terribly sincere kind of objective. Or at least it was naive. Because often people conflate or confuse democracy with having elections. And don't think that, there are things that happen before elections and things that have to happen after elections for a democracy to function. And so I think that people will, in the State Department and elsewhere, by the way, the State Department was not consulted and no one listened to what the State Department had to say about before the invasion in Iraq. I mean, our government deliberately did not ask experts about Iraq, or at least they went to experts that they knew would give the answer that they wanted to hear. Okay, so as far as democracy and secularism is concerned, I'm not arguing that somehow Muslims are genetically incapable of it. I'm saying that certain interpretations that are dominant today will not permit it. And that eventually, through experience, and through bitter experience, Muslims will, hopefully, emerge with other interpretations that will permit Islam and democracy and secularism to become compatible. But that's not going to happen overnight. It will take many decades.
School of thought said that it was possible and that we should pursue it. I think it is much more of something that's sidled into propaganda purposes.
Yeah, and perhaps, President Bush really does believe, that people... no, I'm serious here. I'm not actually making fun of him. I think he does, believe that, there's a profound sort of desire for freedom in all human beings, and that, Iraqis should have it too. But, it takes certain steps and takes, certain preparation for that to happen. It can't just, just because he desires it or wishes it, it doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. And interestingly enough, when you talk about freedom, it's very interesting to see what Al-Qaeda has to say about freedom. Because Al-Qaeda, and bin Laden specifically, says to Bush, and says to America in many of his messages, that yes, we love freedom just like you love freedom, but our freedom is the freedom to resist tyranny and oppression, and you represent tyranny and oppression. That's why he claims to be free. Yes, sir?
My one question was, you mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood sort of scenario in Egypt.
Yes.
What would stop them when they do fall, as you hypothesized, from turning into an element like in Palestine? Or would they just radicalize and then you have this sort of a vicious circle starting again, where they then say, they radicalize and then they sort of blame it on us, and we're the sort of scapegoat of
They will.
in some way.
Yeah.
So is there, I understand that eventually economic forces at some level, there'd be starvation eventually, but...
Or civil war.
Civil war, wouldn't there be enough splinter groups to sort of come out of that a unified government that would be slightly more liberal wouldn't really come
Yeah, it might not come about. And you know, as I said, this is going to be a long and arduous and very bloody, and lots of people will die, no doubt, in countries like Egypt and elsewhere, for political change to happen. The thing that I feel strongly about is that you can't force political change on people. It has to come from within. And you know the Prophet, and this is what I'm going to end with, the Prophet of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, once said, in Arabic it says, تَكُونُ كَمَا يُوَلَّ عَلَيْكُمْ in Arabic, which means that you are, you know, you deserve the rulers. You are what you, you deserve the rulers you get, basically. You know, that, change has to come from within. It cannot come from without. Thank you.
I also want to thank Ruth Wilson. Please stand up, Ruth. Thank you very much. See you next semester.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
I'll take your
Yeah.
speaker.